So, today's video comes from Prospect Magazine, and this, I think, is really good, because I have not seen this done anywhere else, but I think it explains quite a lot, and you really see that what's happening now would not be unusual, given the fact that you've had Theresa May do a whirlwind tour of all the countries, and they basically just told her, yeah, no thanks. Because one of the big things that Brexiteers told us would be that all the European Union nations would be split, and they would be supporting us, not the EU's position. But not a single one of them has split ranks or done anything like that at all. Why is that, do you think? So, the guy who wrote this article, Christopher Gray, I'll leave a link to it down below, basically did a thought experiment. And it's basically this: what if it wasn't Britain leaving, but another member state? So that's the scenario. Britain is still in the European Union, and there is another member state leaving the European Union. So we'll go into it now. So imagine a scenario where it was not Britain leaving the European Union, but one of the other member states. Whilst Britain was remaining, it was worth considering because it helps us to understand how, in the real scenario of Brexit, the EU27 are reacting. In particular, it helps us to understand why that reaction should not be described as punishment. In this hypothetical case, Britain's reaction would depend partly upon which country we imagine was leaving. Suppose it was Ireland, then Britain would see its key strategic interest, the need to preserve the Northern Ireland peace process and uphold the Good Friday Agreement. Central to that would be ensuring that a non-negotiable position that whatever form Ireland's departure took, it would not create a hard border on the island. Britain would undoubtedly put maximum pressure upon the EU to hardwire this into Ireland's withdrawal agreement. As a backstop, let's call it, it was difficult to imagine many British politicians arguing otherwise. Whichever country was leaving, it is a reasonable assumption that the central British requirement would be to preserve the integrity of the single market. After all, Britain, starting with Margaret Thatcher's government, has been its strongest proponent. It was Thatcher whose 1988 Bruges speech, despite inspiring a generation of Eurosceptics, talked enthusiastically of opening up the single market and berated other members for not doing so to a sufficient extent. And much of the basic architecture of the single market was devised by the Conservative member, subsequently European Commissioner Lord Cockfield. Successive British governments have done the same thing, championing the extension of the single market into new areas, especially services. One of the main reasons why the French voted against a European constitution in their 2005 referendum was that they saw it as expressing a Blairite neoliberal Europe, in which economics of the single market rather than social Europe predominated. As recently as the 2015 election manifesto, the one that promised a referendum, the Conservative Party proclaimed, "We say yes to the single market," and spoke of extending it in the future to new sectors like digital, which is what they're doing now. So it seems certain that in a hypothetical scenario, Britain would be arguing strongly that the departing member could not have its cake and eat it. It would either be in the single market or accepting all of its rules, or out of the single market and no longer enjoying its benefits. Britain would surely be saying that the available options for the ex-member to have a European Free Trade Association, that's the single market arrangement of Canada Freestyle trade deal, but not mix and match. If the exiting country would not agree to that, then it would leave without a deal and accept the consequences of that choice. Moreover, it seems certain that most strongly of these views would be British Eurosceptics, people we now call Brexiteers, who would see that any cherry-picking as taking advantage of Britain by giving the ex-member state unfair access to its markets without paying the budget contributions or accepting the rules. We would surely lambast the EU if it showed any sign of wavering on this. To do so, they say, would show the EU at its very worst, doing shady, unprincipled deals rather than applying the rules properly and fairly. In short, Britain and Eurosceptics especially would be the staunchest advocate for precisely the position being taken by the EU towards Brexit. Exactly the same could be said of other areas of context, in context of Brexit, for example. Would Britain argue for the departing member to pay its outstanding financial commitments, or to be let off, or only to pay in exchange for a cherry-picked trade deal? The answers are obvious, as in the fact that Britain would be furious with the EU to take a different line. Or again, would Britain be saying that the former member state could be part of agencies like the Galileo satellite programme, or saying that it would be allowed to piggyback on British efforts and that the departing country should be like any other third country? Would Britain be seeking to directly safeguard the rights of its citizens living in the departing country, or be happy to leave them to their fate without regard for what the future might hold for them? Again, all these questions answer themselves. It's quite obvious what Britain's position would be on all these issues. Quite obvious that it would be urging on the other EU countries, and quite obvious that the EU as a whole would take a different line. Britain, Eurosceptics especially, would be extremely unhappy with the EU. If this all accepted, then a final questions arise. Would Britain's stance in these various respects be a reasonable one, or would it be punitive? And that's the big question that you leave with, because as said here, I just want to go over, where is it? So, yeah, let me just read it, because this is really true, this. And in short, Britain and Eurosceptics especially would be the staunchest advocates of precisely the position being taken by the EU towards Brexit. You see all this stuff, and you see, one of the things you see other European nations, they're all very much united because the single market is really good. It enables them to get really good trade deals, where if they were by themselves, they wouldn't be able to get as good trade deals. This is one of the things that still shocks me, is that Brexiteers seem to magically think that we can still be in that single market, yet be out and doing our own thing, and changing our rules, and then, this just doesn't make any lick of sense. But now we're going to go on to WTO terms, and I highly recommend two videos you go and watch if you think WTO terms are going to be any good. Go watch James O'Brien's talk he had with an expert on the WTO rules, and where he goes over those, because that's, again, I think that interview should be played here, there and everywhere, because it's exactly what we need to be told about the WTO. It is not a good option. No other country trades exclusively on WTO terms. You then have an amazing video called 3 Men in a Pub Discuss Brexit, I think it was called. But that's equally as good. And I'd highly recommend it to anyone out there to go and watch that. Certainly those two videos, because here you have an amazing point of, these are all the problems we are going to be facing. The government, and particularly Brexiteers, don't seem to have any solution to them. Considering especially guys like Daniel Hannan spent 27 years campaigning for Britain to leave the EU, but doesn't have any ideas or, anything concrete that he can put to the government saying we should be doing it this way, because he doesn't want to be scrutinised. And to people saying that we're being, having punitive actions taken us by the EU, just go over what we've just been in that article. Britain is one of the biggest, was one of the biggest advocates for the single market, and especially pushing it into new areas. Services being a prime example. 80% of our economy is based on services. The only trade deal in the world to cover services is the single market. And yet we're leaving that because it's somehow a good solution to leave. I think this makes a really good point of, look, Britain would be doing, if another country was leaving the European Union, Britain would be doing exactly the same as any of the single other European countries. So, no, it's not punitive. It's just what has always been the case, and particularly what us Remainers have been telling you since the very beginning. Leaving the single market was a completely dumb idea. And here's the thing. If you go back to the referendum campaign, you will find loads of campaigners for leave basically saying, oh yeah, we're not going to leave the single market or customs union, that only an idiot would do that. Daniel Hannan himself said only a fool would leave the single market. And yet here we are, basically about to leave the single market and the customs union. Because it's what these hard right Tories like Jacob Rees-Mogg and the European Research Group have wanted for years. They have hated the fact that government regulations get in the way of trade. They want to completely get rid of any regulations completely. They think the government should not be involved at all in regulating the market. And if you don't believe me, this is a core principle of UKIP. Literally, their manifesto was, we're going to have a bonfire of regulations. What regulations do you want to get rid of? No, we're going to have a bonfire of regulations. But what regulation? We're going to have a bonfire! And it's like, this is one of the dangers of parties like UKIP. They say things like that, which sound, good and maybe appealing, but when you get to the nitty-gritty and ask for specifics, that's where the specifics just don't exist. But yeah, there you go. But yeah, I want to know what other people's thoughts, particularly on this, would be, because as a thought experiment, I do agree with it. I think if there was another country leaving the European Union, I think you would get exactly this scenario that was laid out in Prospect magazine. We would be pushing the EU to not allow this, this member state, certainly not allow it to leave without paying its commitments. We then wouldn't be allow it to be part of any of the programs, particularly something like Galileo, and we wouldn't be allowing for them to cherry pick the single market. Yet you turn around and that's exactly what our government is arguing for. It's absolutely bizarre.